Joining us now on the line from Los Angeles, California, Michael Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, one-time Democratic presidential nominee, now teaching at UCLA. Mr. Dukakis, or I guess I should say governor, as is the American custom, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How's things on the left coast?
Good to be with you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we get to Ronald Reagan's legacy, I just want to ask whether or not you had any personal dealings with the man, given that your terms as governor, in your second incarnation as governor, overlapped with much of his presidency. So did you have any dealings with him personally?
Well, not personally, but every year the governors have a midwinter meeting in Washington. And part of that is a session with the president and then usually a state dinner in the evening. So with my fellow governors, I certainly had an opportunity to spend time with them, interact with them. But not in any direct personal sense. I don't recall ever being in the Oval Office with him or negotiating over something in that sense.
Once you decided to run for the presidency, though, I guess you two became better acquainted because he called you an invalid in the middle of your campaign. He later apologized, but did he ever come up to you sort of personally and say, yeah, I went a bit too far?
No, he didn't, and in point of fact, I always thought that was staged because it was a planted question. The whole thing was ridiculous. And I just think that was the White House's way of trying to get to me or something, but never made any sense. You know, some people like me, some people don't like me. I don't know of anyone who's ever questioned my health. And so I've always thought that was kind of a staged thing, and regrettably he participated in it. Okay,
let's get on to the Reagan record, because you of course ran against his vice president, George Bush the father, in 1988. So you would have been intimately aware of the Reagan record because you were campaigning against it. Let's start with strengths and weaknesses thereof. What did you consider to be Ronald Reagan's greatest strength as the 40th president of the United States?
Well, I'd say two things. First, he was an optimist. And I'm a great believer, if you're going to lead a country or lead a state or lead a city, you've got to be an optimist. I don't mean a cockeyed optimist. You've got to be realistic. But Reagan was a guy that thought we could do things. And while I didn't agree with a great deal of what he wanted to do, there was no question that he brought this kind of sunny optimism to the White House, and beyond that, really restored the prestige of the presidency. You know, prior to his election, there were an awful lot of people who were saying the presidency is an impossible job. We ought to have two presidents. We ought to have a single 6-year term, all this kind of stuff. I always thought it was nonsense myself. But there's no question that within a relatively short period of time, although he had a rocky first 2 or 3 years, certainly people were not saying that any longer. And I think to his credit, he had a lot to do with that.
In fact, if you look back, you've got Jimmy Carter failing to get reelected. You got Gerald Ford, who was never elected in the first place, Nixon resigning in disgrace, LBJ declining to seek an extra term, Kennedy was assassinated. He did, I guess, bring an end to the notion that you couldn't do this job anymore. Is that fair to say?
No question about it. No question about it. And for that, he deserves a lot of credit.
Okay, the conventional wisdom also has been over the years that it was President Reagan's, if you don't like this word, pick a better word, but bellicosity towards the Soviet Union that helped win the Cold War. Is that fair to say?
No, I don't think that's fair to say. A lot of people say that, and a lot of Reagan supporters say that. I think the inherent contradictions in the Soviet system really brought them down. And I think it had much less to do with the fact that he went to Berlin and told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the wall and that kind of stuff. It was good theater. And a lot of people responded to that, but the Soviet Union was in increasingly bad shape, and I think it had a lot to do with the fundamental flaws in the system. The remarkable thing is that a Soviet insider named Gorbachev became the great change agent, but I don't think Reagan had a lot to do with that.
He was the first president, though, I think, who said, when asked, what's your principle about the Cold War, he said, we win, they lose. We weren't going to, play détente with him anymore. He wanted to win the Cold War.
Well, that's what he said. On the other hand, and here I think was one of Reagan's great achievements, he was the guy willing to sit down with Gorbachev and negotiate successfully the so-called zero option, which committed both us and the Soviet Union to totally eliminate intermediate range ballistic missiles. So while the rhetoric was pretty tough, the fact of the matter was, to his credit, that he saw an opportunity And of all the things that Reagan did, I think negotiating that agreement with Gorbachev was by far the most important thing he did.
Well, speaking of rhetoric, I'm not sure there was a better metaphor ever used than when Ronald Reagan described America as a shining city on a hill. After 8 years of his presidency, do you think that was accurate?
Well, once we went into that terrible period with the Iran-Contra scandal, and when he and his vice president were deliberately misleading the Congress and the American people, and they had Colonel North and those folks shredding documents in the basement of the White House and all that kind of stuff, hard to say that this country was a shining city on a hill. It was anything but. And it was a pretty depressing period. And in point of fact, I think it's fair to say that he was depressed. For weeks, he didn't function very effectively. It was a very tough and a very distressing period in American history. So I'm afraid we weren't a shining city on the hill by the time he left office, and at least to some extent he was responsible for that.
Well, you've dovetailed us nicely into considering some of Ronald Reagan's weaknesses, and I guess Iran-Contra would be at the top of the list in terms of foreign policy. Do you think, though, after having lived through it and perhaps studied it later, that he actually knew what was going on in his name?
Oh, he was no dope. I mean, I don't think we do have the latest revelations in his son's book about the fact that even while in the White House, he seemed to be showing signs of dementia. And by the way, although I'm not sure I'd make that diagnosis, when we governors met with him in the middle of the day, sometimes you'd wonder a little bit about him. By evening, when we got to dinner at the White House, he was as sharp as a tack. But there was a kind of disconnect there occasionally that was pretty concerning. But I don't think there was a time when he didn't know what was going on. I mean, the fact of the matter is that he and his administration deliberately violated the law, entered into negotiations with Iran during what was a terrible war between Iran and Iraq, where, 1 million people were killed. And in the meantime, they were violating strict prohibitions against what they were doing in Central America. Now, that's pretty serious stuff. And frankly, it's one of the reasons I ran for the presidency, because I didn't have any intention. I'd never thought of running for the presidency until the Iran-Contra scandal hit. And then I kind of looked at this and I said, I can't believe this. You know, some of us have got to go out and see if we can change this. So he knew what was going on. I don't think there's any question about that.
Let me follow up on your comment where you referred to when you met him as governor, or when as a group of governors met him, and he did not seem to be all there, say in the mid-afternoon. There was this recurring story you would hear that Ronald Reagan certainly was brilliant at articulating a kind of grand vision for where he wanted America to go, but he wasn't that interested in the details, or didn't seem to have his hand firmly on the tiller of running the government. Was that accurate?
He knew enough about the details. I mean, again, I think it's a mistake to assume that he was kind of detached and a little vague and that kind of stuff. I mean, that was not Ronald Reagan. I think he delegated a lot of authority to people. I think his management style was to kind of focus on his priorities and not to get deeply involved in details and to leave that to others. And as long as you pick good people to do that, you can be okay. But particularly, we used to meet with him about 11 o'clock in the morning, and I always had a sense that at that time of day, he wasn't focusing. He'd begin to tell stories and this kind of stuff, and you'd wonder a little bit about what was going on there. But in general, I don't think it's accurate to say that he wasn't in control and didn't have a grip on the situation and so forth. I mean, he was plenty involved with what he was doing. And, you know, there is some value to being a chief executive who can focus on a limited number of priorities and get them done, rather than to get so deeply involved in the details of everything that you get nothing done.
Sure. We got a new word in the, I guess, American lexicon when he was president, and that was Reaganomics. The notion of cutting taxes, thereby spurring on economic activity, bringing more revenue into Washington, along with cuts in public spending that would presumably balance the budget. How well do you think Reaganomics worked in hindsight?
Well, Reaganomics was a joke. I mean, it didn't work. It doesn't work. We've gone through another 8-year period under Bush where they tried the same thing, and we all know what happened. I mean, it almost threw us into another Great Depression. And by the way, some of these guys are back in the Congress, and they're proposing the same thing. Now, I don't know how many times the American people are going to buy into this, but it didn't work under Reagan. The notion that you could dramatically cut taxes and somehow increase public revenue was always a myth, and it never worked. And in fact, Reagan actually increased taxes 13 times after his initial tax cuts. So Reaganomics, supply-side economics, that kind of stuff never worked, and yet, at least in this country, Republicans seem to believe that that's what you got to do, and they come back and do it again and again and again. I mean, look at the Bush years. 5 tax cuts, 2 wars, and they almost threw us into another depression. Now, why my fellow citizens decided to elect so many of these folks committed to exactly that approach to government back during the midterms is beyond me. I don't understand it. I can understand people's frustration with the economic situation here. Why would you elect people who are committed to doing exactly what happened under Reagan and exactly what happened under Bush? It's a mystery to me, but here we are.
Well, I wonder if it speaks to that first answer you gave at the beginning of our talk, that somehow Mr. Reagan did manage to project this sunny optimism and made people feel good about being Americans again, and therefore they were content to follow him where he wanted to go.
That he did, but Americans at the end of George Bush's second term were not sunny, were not optimistic, were not content, and in point of fact, we almost went off the cliff in an economic sense. So, and I believe that this president, who we now have in the Congress, not only stopped the slide, I mean, we are in point of fact slowly, not dramatically, but slowly beginning to turn it around and head back in the other direction. You know, we did it under Reagan, who, by the way, added more to the national debt than all of the presidents from George Washington and Jimmy Carter combined. We elected a guy named Bill Clinton, who not only brought the economy back with 20 million new jobs, 4% unemployment, but actually was cutting the national debt and proposed a plan to eliminate it in 10 to 12 years. Well, he left office. Bush didn't get elected, but he got into the White House, and we started the same process all over again with disastrous results. So it's a bit of a conundrum here, at least for me, to try to understand why people don't see this, and yet maybe it's the fault of the Democrats. Maybe we just didn't do a very effective job of communicating what we were doing and why we were doing it.
Well, let's spend our remaining moments talking about Ronald Reagan's ultimate legacy. You know, there was a lot of talk, I guess, a couple of years ago about, I know he got the airport in Washington named after him, but some people were talking about putting him on, you know, the $10 bill or carving his face into Mount Rushmore. Do you think he is one of the great presidents your country has ever had?
No, I didn't think Reagan was a very good president, even though there were some things he did that were fine. But in general, I thought the Reagan years were not good years for America. The gap between rich and poor began to grow dramatically, and it continues to grow. There's an enormous amount that this country should be doing that it isn't doing, and I was not a fan of his policies or of what happened. And as we all know, shortly after he left office and George H.W. Bush took over, we went into another recession, and it was Bill Clinton that really pulled us out of it.
How do you account for the fact, then, that almost everybody who runs for the Republican presidential nomination these days always wants to describe him or herself as a Reagan Republican?
Beats the hell out of me. I don't understand it. But you know, compared to some of these Tea Partiers, Ronald Reagan is a pretty reasonable guy. And by the way, and this was another strength of his, despite his rhetoric, and remember, he had been a very liberal Democrat before he flipped. Despite his rhetoric, he was not a guy that would go over the cliff for his ideology. I mean, he and Tip O'Neill sat down and negotiated a compromise on Social Security, which has stood us in very good stead ever since. This was back in the mid-'80s. He worked with Dan Rostenkowski and Dick Gephardt and others to reform the tax code, did a pretty good job of it. He was a much more pragmatic guy than his rhetoric would suggest, and far more willing to sit down and work out solutions on a bipartisan basis than some of this crowd that's just arrived in the House of Representatives. So in that sense, there's a lot to be said for him.
Since you mentioned Tip O'Neill, let's finish up on that. Your fellow former Bostonian, former Speaker of the House, who I think one of his best lines was, Ronald Reagan was a lousy president, but he'd have made a hell of a king. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I suppose what he was saying was that in terms of the office itself, of his ability to inspire people and to lift them up and give them a much better and more optimistic sense of where this country was going, in that sense, there was a kind of royal cast to what he was doing. When it came to running the government, he wasn't so good. The interesting thing about those two guys, though, it seems to me, was that they were able to sit down to develop a rather close and good friendship, even though they were ideologically poles apart. And from time to time, and the Social Security reform was an example of this, worked together to achieve some very significant goals. I mean, Reagan wasn't a guy that believed in privatizing Social Security. He thought it was important, and it was an important part of this country's safety net, and he worked with the Speaker to achieve that, and in the course of it, raised taxes to do so. That doesn't sound like the kind of stuff that we're getting out of this Congress and that we're going to get out of Congressman Ryan tonight, and that we're going to hear in the course of the next weeks and months. He was a much more pragmatic guy in that sense, and he deserves credit for that.
Didn't both men once say that despite their political differences, they were both a couple of Irish guys who enjoyed a drink and therefore could do business together? They did have that in common.
Indeed, and in point of fact, after 6 o'clock at night, they were good friends, and they enjoyed a good drink, and they got some things done together.
Governor, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so glad you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Real pleasure. Thanks.